Much of the art you see in this video is created by the artist Hagen. Hagen took no part in scripting this video, voicing, or conlanging. Hagen's images were not initially intended for this presentation, and I did not commission him to make them. However, I did specifically get his permission to use them for this video. If you like what you see, check out his blue sky. 日本語を大学で勉強しましたが、僕の日本語はとても下手になりました。間違えてすみませんでした。ビデオを見てくれてありがとうございます。There were many instances throughout human history where people came in contact with beasts and where our war eradicated them. Many may be familiar with the War of Orcs in Britain, documented by J.R.R. Tolkien in his autobiography, Lord of the Rings. Fewer in the West, however, are familiar with the Orcish War in Japan between humans and another race, often called orcs but sometimes referred to as the Butaģin. Unlike the orcs, however, the Butaģin still survive to this day and live among us. At the time, these orcs picked up Japanese and could communicate with it. However, their language evolved, first dropping formalities completely, then undergoing other phonological and grammatical changes, becoming something much more complex. The Japanese people described the language as a vulgar and brutish method of communication and regarded it as a mangled and bastardized form of the Japanese language. However, I wanted to set out and learn this language to understand the nuances of the grammar and to document it in order to end the stigma of this language and its people, and to show that it is its own unique language with different grammatical rules. So when I first arrived in Japan, I wandered into the forests looking for the Butaģin to communicate with. I was lucky enough to encounter Aazo, a trilingual Butaģin who speaks Japanese, English, and Butago. I explained to him my intentions, that I wished to study his language, to document it, and to do general typological research in order to destigmatize his language, and to show the greater population that it is a complex language that is distinct and separate from Japanese. He happily obliged and brought me to his village. Upon seeing me there, the locals seemed rather confused by my presence, and he seemed to take a long time to explain what I was doing there. While I couldn't understand much of what they were saying, I took time to jot down what phonemes I heard to make a phonology chart. And oh boy, it was not what I was expecting to hear from a descendant of modern Japanese. So to start off with some of the simple changes, the 5 vowels with length contrasts have now turned into 8 vowels, only 6 of which have contrasting length. And all vowels can be either nasalized or have this seemingly creaky, ingressive quality. But more about that later. As for the new consonants, there isn't too much crazy at first, just unusual for a language evolved from Japanese, as there's now phonemic kl, ch, and ch, like in the words waka, hk, and cht. In addition, the velar nasal is now phonemic, as is the alveolar affricate, and they both contrast with g and t respectively. Now the part that's really baffling to me are the grunt sounds. The Butaģin often grunt their voices when speaking, and this register I transcribed as creaky voice, but it doesn't seem to actually be articulated with the glottis, but through the nasal passage somehow, which humans can't really produce. In some cases, these grunt vowels sound more ingressive than creaky, like in the case of I. In addition to grunt vowels, they also have 2 phonemic grunt consonants that are a high-toned grunt and a low-toned grunt, except humans can't produce these either, so I've transcribed them as the ingressive nasal trill and the labialized ingressive nasal trill. In terms of phonotactics, it seems that any word with a voiceless E or U now have consonant clusters in their wake. R, M, N, Ng, Y, and W cannot end a syllable, or at least they don't often end a syllable, and vowel hiatus seems to be completely gone. In Japanese, the word for blue is aoi, but Aazo's name involves the color blue and is pronounced with an ah sound instead. After much discussion, Aazo told me what was going on. My presence was a surprise and caused much anxiety and uncertainty, so there would be another Buta-jin that would keep an eye on me. Okunak was very tall, strong, and had a stone-faced expression that made me feel like he hated me for existing. Aazo told me I shouldn't worry too much, and in the meantime, he would introduce me to some of his friends. I tried to calm down and learn the basics as Aazo spoke to me. He taught me how to introduce myself and used the cup of tea we were drinking as an example object, and taught me different ways of conjugating verbs. Immediately, I found differences in the grammar. In Japanese, there's a default word order of subject-object to verb. However, word order can be pretty flexible in some cases. While verbs always come last, postpositional phrases can sometimes come before or after an object. Sometimes an object can come before the subject, and so on. While Buta was still a head final language, the syntax is completely non-configurational. Verbs can come at the beginning or end of the sentence, objects can go before or after verbs, but a lot of the time objects would be incorporated into verbs. Some speakers of Japanese, native or non-native, may feel compelled at this point to ask about the case system. You may think, oh well, if Buta is an evolution of Japanese, that must mean that cases are fully fledged affixes, right? They may be really weird and unpredictable phonologically. And you'd be wrong, the case system is almost completely defunct. When I first started learning the language, I thought that it was completely gone, but it's hiding somewhere. More on that later. Instead of marking for case, Buta actually marks for polypersonal agreement. Or I would say it's polypersonal agreement, but in actuality there's too few prefixes for it to be that way. It seems almost like an inverse system based on animacy or relevance, which felt weird to me, but I didn't have enough time to figure out why. Either way, with frequent use of polypersonal markers, frequent use of noun incorporation, and free word order, I made a shocking realization about the language. Buta is polysynthetic. For me, it was both a relief to hear as well as a terrifying fact. It was a relief because I did some research about how polysynthesis works in college, so I'm fairly familiar. But on the other hand, polysynthesis is still a confusing mechanism and is hard for a native English speaker like me to wrap their head around in the context of speaking. Regardless, it's very strange for a dependent marking language like Japanese to become a polysynthetic language, as those languages are more often head marking. Eventually, I thanked them and left the forest, going to an inn I was staying at. Each day I would come back, practice the language, and learn some more. One day I asked if there was any way I could see some writing, and with Okunak still standing behind me to make sure I didn't do anything, they allowed me to sit in on a children's writing class. As I expected, Buta wrote with kana. They mostly use katakana, but there was the occasional hiragana, and I found that hiragana would always be associated with a grunt sound. Also, to my surprise, they seemed to use a tilde over the kana to represent a nasal vowel. I asked Okunak how such a thing came to be, and he wrote a hiragana N over a katakana A, then wrote it again to show how the N became a squiggle in shorthand. So basically, it came through the exact same way as the original tilde came to be, but entirely independent of the evolution of the Latin alphabet. The writing class reminded me a little bit of a spelling lesson in English, where the teacher would put multiple kana together and talk about how to pronounce them. It became clear that there's a ton of historical spelling in Buta, resembling Japanese. This makes it easy for people who understand Japanese or phonological evolution, but hard for anyone without an understanding of those things. For example, any vowel clusters were preserved in each word, so long vowels can be spelled in a number of different ways. U is spelled with a katakana O, and not a modification of U, whereas O is spelled with an O and U katakana together. One part that's hard to understand are the consonant clusters because sometimes they're spelled with the U or E kana, like the coda G would be spelled with a G. But if the vowel that's lost is historically any other vowel, then that vowel is disregarded, and the coda is spelt with a tiny kana that agrees with the previous vowel, just like how Ainu deals with R codas. And the only way to tell when to use each of these is either by memorizing it through brute force or knowing the etymology from modern Japanese. The hardest part, however, is that there's instances of metathesis that could happen at morpheme boundaries, and they're not accounted for in spelling. You just need to remember to swap a couple of phonemes around in certain instances. Needless to say, I had a lot to take in. One day, when we were wandering around the village, we came across a drummer. I couldn't tell if she was playing for some kind of ceremony or if she was just practicing, but she was all by herself and dressed in a pretty lavish mask. As she passed by, I tried to lighten the mood with okunak by striking up a conversation, telling him that I'm a percussionist too, and to my surprise, he did engage me in conversation. I spoke in simple sentences, breaking up each clause and identifying the subject in every phrase, while okunak, being a native speaker, of course, spoke in much more complicated compound sentences. And it was through this conversation that I realized exactly why the polypersonal markers were the way that they are, and I came up with a theory as to why very few are used. In Japanese, you often omit the subject of a sentence if it's either obvious who you're talking about or if you're talking about yourself. In addition, the level of respect you show towards someone depends on what pronouns you use for yourself or for others. The third-person pronouns are seldom used, unless it's in an informal context, because kare and kanojo have the connotation of boyfriend and girlfriend sometimes, so that's a little weird. These two aspects of Japanese pronouns must have carried over during the development of the system of polypersonal agreement, where the Butajin would avoid using the first person to talk about themselves and always try to incorporate the object into the verb when talking about a third person. If the subject is first person, they have a null affix to represent them. If the object is first person, they have a passivized verb. A similar thing happens with the copula, where a regular copula is used for the unmarked first person to give the meaning of I am, and the locative copula is used for an unmarked third person to give the meaning of there is, which turns into this is. The inverse marking isn't that unusual, as some languages with verb agreement have animacy hierarchies, making it so that the most animate noun will always be the subject. And this is kind of what's happening here, but rather than it being about animacy, it's about relevance, where the first person is considered the most relevant, then the second person, then the proximal third person. And if a less relevant person is subject to a more relevant object, then passivization is used. What makes this more difficult is this is also where the defunct case system comes in. An active verb and its object may have an u affix between them coming from the old accusative marker wo, whereas for a passive verb, there may be an n affix between the passivized verb and the noun coming from the marker ni. These old case markers often act like applicatives that can either affix onto the verb or affix on the noun that's incorporated into the verb. And many nouns and verbs tend to react differently to each applicative. There's not a very clear pattern how to inflect nouns and verbs for these applicatives, and if you want to learn them, it's better to just memorize for each word. So what's strange about this language is that it's a polysynthetic language that jumps through hoops to use as few polypersonal markers as possible, making it more difficult to learn and decipher. But don't worry, it's about to get more complicated. In Japanese, both a first person and a proximal third person subject is often omitted. So, how does this transfer into this language? How do they go from telling apart the first and third person subjects? Maybe they choose one pronoun to take the place of the third person, or maybe they utilize their classifiers for all third person subjects. Or maybe they use an adjunct to give reference to the subject in every sentence. Well, it turns out that when the third person is first introduced, you could use a classifier or an adjunct to give reference to it. But the proximal third person simply isn't marked at all. How is that possible? Well, unlike Japanese, this language almost always has the unmarked form to indicate a first-person subject, and cannot use the topic to change the subject. Therefore, in this language, compounding sentences is a requirement in order to properly mark the third person in every clause. One can repeat an affix or an adjunct in every sentence, but to speakers of Buta:R, it just sounds repetitive and clunky. It's also important to keep in mind that converbs combine with the main verb clause to make an even larger verb, and separate clauses don't make up separate words. And you might think, oh, well, if there's separate clauses, then surely they must be separate words, right? Well, no. And there's two reasons to why this is the case. The first reason is that the subject does not change throughout this, and throughout the entire sentence is the same null pronoun. Whereas there is no true object, as these verbs always have an incorporated noun, making the verbal phrase intransitive technically. While you could analyze the sentence as having several null pronouns, what's really happening ultimately when you look at the syntax is it's just one long verb with a semantically complex meaning. The second piece of evidence that these various different clauses are the same word is much more concrete: metathesis. Metathesis is pretty prominent in Buta:R, especially at morpheme boundaries. So there are times when consonants and vowels between each clause may flip-flop, or you may have entire syllables swap places. There's also instances of sound changes causing two syllables across two different clauses to fuse together, making it impossible to separate each clause without inflecting words differently. After thinking of all of this, I decided I needed to take a walk to clear my head. The writing, the difficult pronunciations, the high degree of synthesis, the non-configurational syntax, all of it was too much for my brain to handle, and I needed to clear my head. Unexpectedly, I found another Buta:jin on the outskirts of the forest by the river. She asked me what was wrong, and I simply told her I was stressed and my head hurt. She told me to sit down and made me tea. Needless to say, I was pretty touched by this stranger's actions, and I expressed my gratitude. After a little bit of tea and a bit of quiet time, she asked me why I was so upset, and I told her that I came here to learn her language and to document it, but I just had such a hard time understanding it. She smiled at me and told me I didn't need to worry and that she'd help me understand. For hours we went through the grammar, where I'd ask her about something I had difficult understanding, and she would sort it out, explaining to me how it would work. She would compare different classes of verbs to each other and began categorizing them for me to make it easier for me to understand, and it made it so much simpler for me. For now, I'll talk about a few different rules and a few different types of verbs she taught me about. I'm sure I'm missing a ton of info here, but I think this will make for a good overview. First and foremost, it's important to remember that the person marking on verbs depends on this inverse marker at the end of verbs, and that the inverse marker often fuses with tense, aspect, or mood markers. Therefore, tense, aspect, and mood are often intertwined with polypersonal agreement. In that case, it's recommended to memorize the polypersonal markers for each verb. The first kind of verbs are noun-like verbs, which are basically any phrase that uses a copula. These verbs have an irregular way of differentiating between the first and third person subjects, as they use the locative copula for the third person just to make the phrase intransitive, giving off the meaning of there is instead of it is. They often end with the "da" suffix. The second kinds of verbs are an irregular category of "ru" verbs that can affix a sh sound in different conjugations. These verbs were formerly suru verbs in Japanese, but shortened to ru in Buta:R. All irregularities carry over from Japanese, but these conjugate very similar to the other kind of begin with a consonant. These verbs are very simple because they don't have a ton of irregularity in their prefixes or suffixes, and their prefixes change independently, so you don't need to memorize 100 different forms of may have a number of different forms that depend on how the final consonant looked, all of which have different irregular conjugations. There are many instances where an initial consonant changes during from adjectives also have their own unique conjugations, specifically E adjectives. These verbs are often intransitive and stative and can be made dynamic using the suffix "wa." Certain verbs may also have their own built-in vowel.
The more important question here is, how does one figure out how to conjugate each verb?
Vowel inserted.
Well,
and as
verbs depend on a number of different things, such as the number of syllables, whether or not the verb begins with a vowel,
so when one learns the
what
dictionary
vowel
form
the
of
verb
a verb,
begins with,
it's just good
whether
to
or not
remember that
there's
there
a
will be an
grunted
additional
vowel, and a number of other factors
that were once three syllables
that began with
the vowel
often taken
taken
fixed for their applicative,
whether it's a noun
the
or a
verb
verb.
kadu evolved from
The
Japanese
accusative
applicative
makes
makes
it
it
kodu.
kodu.
Combinations of the
makes
feeler
it a
nasal
cluster
and
vowel
between
often
the
goes
nasal
on,
and the guttural obstruent of some
Each stop
kind.
cluster is worded
as a
usually
method
also
of
become a
conjugating
low
passive. There are a handful of
finally,
verbs that
changes
change
to
regular
regular
passive
any
grunted
forms.
vowels.
In Japanese, there are irregular forms of the same verb.
And intransitive verbs.
There's a lot more to know, but just knowing a few of these rules makes verbs seem a lot less daunting. And so I think this story has a happy ending, as I definitely believe that today I've sufficiently asserted that Buta:R is a distinct language from Japanese and that it has its own complex system of grammar. But before I finish the story, I want to share a poem that was shared with me during my time with the Buta:jin. It's about the universe and the endless cycle of time. 유다나흐비나 흠무느 누한티지보라 더 마르니마아 음아까와 하무츠쿠차유 에 노니 이누치화 흡이키바토코미나 아투키노보라미 후네카 뜨크츠 키니무콘토나야노스위 하토 타벤티쿠 타브르르모주이 Nuki oni hambumara sasayakuto. Tuki nukrenaka kranaka de tuno kashidu kukru seka ukru. As I said at the start, much of the art you saw throughout the video was by Hagen, but the thumbnail of this video was by the artist Butago on Blue Sky. An independent artist that makes all sorts of fantasy-themed art and can make beautiful character art, whether it's a human character, an orc, a werewolf, a shark, or whatever species you can imagine. I'd highly recommend checking him out because his art style is beautiful and he's just a really cool guy. All of that being said, thanks for watching the video. I worked really hard on this conlang and I really enjoyed participating in the Cursed Conlang Circus for the second year in a row. This conlang is very different from the conlangs I normally make and is my very first a posteriori conlang, but I think I learned a thing or two along the way. Once again, thanks for watching.